Richard, let's start. In this panoply of scary things out there, where are the biggest geopolitical risks? And let's start with those before we get to cyber. What do you worry about most right now?
Well, I think at any point in time, commentators think that the point that they're at is a critical juncture in history. But we do have two very important things that will be decided in the next few weeks. And they are how far Russia goes in Ukraine and the Western response to that. And the other is whether or not the Iranian nuclear talks succeed or not. President Obama said just 2 days ago that he is no longer going to extend the talks. If the talks don't work this time, he's not going to extend them, except on a technical level. If there's an in-principle decision that needs technical implementation, he'll let that go ahead. But there needs to be, in this round of talks, which end next month, a breakthrough in principle. If either of these things goes badly wrong, I mean, you can imagine for both Ukraine and Iran a spectrum of what could happen. But if either of them go to the far end, the worst end of that spectrum, they would have enormous political and economic effects. The worst case with Iran is that Israel, or perhaps even the United States, feels the need to use force against the Iranian nuclear facility. That would cause a spiraling out of control in the Middle East that would make the current situation in the Middle East, which is unprecedented, as you pointed out, far worse.
We'll get to the Middle East in a minute, and we'll bring it right into that. Let's just start with Russia-Ukraine. What do you think is the worst case scenario there, or the worst plausible scenario? I mean, I'm sure we can talk our way into World War III, but let's sort of stop short of that. What is the worst case within the sort of realms of the likely?
Yeah, within the realms of the likely, I don't see NATO or the United States being involved in the use of force. I think everyone's agreed that's ruled out. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. It's not covered by the guarantee. If this were going on against Estonia, we'd be in a very different situation. So I think everyone knows, and that's a bit of a problem because Putin knows we're not going to go to war over this, and we're not going to use force over this. What we therefore are likely to do is escalate economic sanctions dramatically. And as you know, there are some severe economic sanctions which we've not used, but have been discussed in the last week among heads of state, NATO heads of state.
Do you mean things like access to SWIFT?
Access to SWIFT would be one of them. If you essentially cut Russia out of the international economic system, which that does, at least the international banking system, then from their perspective, they have very little to lose. The effects are not probably going to be swift, no pun intended, on their decisions. Economic sanctions, as we know, do work, but they tend to take years. And unless the people around Putin have a lot more influence over him than we're led to believe, he's going to keep going. So I think the effect there that we need to worry about is, do we collapse the Russian economy so badly that hurts Europe, and in particular Germany?
David, how does that play out in the sense that Russia is, it's a big oil producer and it's been hit hard. In fact, it's been hit harder by the decline in oil prices, arguably, than the sanctions thus far, although they're not unlinked. If you had a very big stepping up of economic sanctions, would you expect Russia to counteract, perhaps on the gas side or something like that? And how would you, as an investor, think about this in terms of gaming through what was likely to happen?
Well, I guess you could go long gas in Europe, which is it's very sensitive to their dependence on Russian gas. But I think Russia is one of the largest oil producers. Most people think of Saudi Arabia and the Middle Eastern states, but Russia's the largest, and 40% of its government revenues are from oil. So it's quite ironic to me that there's so many actions by the State Department and very conscious, deliberated foreign policy. Yet I think the greatest economic impact on some of the countries that we've placed sanctions on, like Russia and Iran, has been the result of private capital deployed in private lands, and maybe the drill bit's mightier than the sword in that case, because it's created a lot of pressure on those countries. In terms of how to play it, I guess one way we've played it to date is not investing in Russia. And we like to invest overseas. Almost half of the dollars we've invested in energy, and I've been at Blackstone for 20 years and in charge of the energy business for about over a decade. We haven't found something that we felt comfortable with in Russia. So we do like investing in countries where there's a perception of high risk, but they're moving in the right direction. And with OPEC now not functioning as a cartel, choosing to step back, without that shock absorber for global oil prices that really stabilized things when sanctions were first placed on Iran and their capacity was taken off the market, Saudi increased production to keep it from going too high. In the past, during the global financial crisis, they took some production off. That stabilizer's not there, so the market for oil is going to be more volatile. And that generally, if you have something that's more volatile, it reduces the amount of investment, and it certainly increases the cost. And that's what we've seen in the U.S., and we've seen it around the globe. So I think it makes us more excited to invest globally in energy. It also puts a premium on being very particular and picking the countries that you invest in and the management teams that you back.
Well, we'll get on to the places where you will invest in a second, but just thinking, so you think differently about Russia. Do you think differently about Eastern Europe, about the peripheries around Russia because of this? I mean, how far does the impact of geopolitical uncertainty go in affecting your decisions there?
Well, everywhere, because an event and I was struck by, as you listed through all the various conflict areas, many of them are significant oil exporters. And that price is telegraphed around the world instantly. So it's not just one country's impact, it's a global impact. And while I think we can be reasonably good at the below-ground analysis and looking at things on a micro level, it's virtually impossible to predict the next, like Libya, which went off.
Except right now it hasn't really been telegraphed, right? Because as you say, because of shale and because of Saudi Arabia's action. So the fact that Nigeria is a big oil exporter, the fact that Libya is an oil exporter, the fact, a lot of these countries are oil exporters. And if you'd said to me a year and a half ago, you're going to have these countries, with sort of jihadis and with, potentially breaking up and huge sort of geopolitical instability, and yet the oil price is going to be where it is, I would have laughed at you.
It's surprising, isn't it? And in the summer, the reason why oil spiked up above 110 was, ISIS was moving and people weren't sure where they were going to go north or for the east.
Todd, does that mean, is there a risk that people like you, and I don't mean obviously you personally, are underestimating the geopolitical risk because of what we've seen because of shale in the last 6 months? That we've all become a little bit complacent about what the impact of all of this would be?
So the oil market's quite interesting because oil is well below the replacement cost, yet there's very little spare capacity. So the Saudis are producing 9.5 million barrels a day. They're close to full capacity. And there really isn't another producer globally that could add another couple 100,000 barrels a day. So for an industry that the world really needs oil, we're running at, give or take, 98, 99% utilization, and yet it's priced at $51 a barrel. So to your point, the market is telling us that we need to slow down U.S. growth to really balance the market, yet there's significant tail risk in case there is another blow up in the country. Ukraine doesn't produce a lot of oil. Greece does not produce a lot of oil. There's an election coming up in Nigeria that's going to be very watched because they produce 1.9 million barrels a day. So you are right, where the market is tight, yet is extremely loose at the same time.
Let's game out the Middle East broadly, because that's clearly still of sort of central importance for the oil markets and more generally. So you said that the danger of a breakdown in the nuclear talks with Iran was one of your two areas that you most worried about. Game through with me what happens then, and how does that interact with the other question in that part of the world that intrigues me, which is, what does $50 barrel oil mean for the relative balance of power between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Because Iran is hit much harder by lower oil prices than Saudi is, although Saudi's hit too. So what does the Middle East look like in the next few, let's say next year or so, if the nuclear talks do fall apart?
Well, again, there's a spectrum of possibilities. It's conceivable that the United States and our European allies would simply continue sanctions and perhaps even look for additional sanctions. There are some that we haven't used yet, and hope that over time Iran changes its mind. There could be, however, in the United States, a decision that that's unacceptable to have an Iranian nuclear bomb, particularly if the Saudis decide the talks have broken down. This means Iran is going to get the bomb, therefore we will get the bomb. And there are a lot of scenarios where the Saudis can get the bomb in about an hour. There are lots of people who believe the Saudis have paid for the Pakistani nuclear program and have an understanding with the Pakistanis that they can call on them to sell them nuclear weapons. And the Saudis have made it crystal clear to every American that they have talked to that if they believe the Iranians are getting a nuclear bomb, they will too, and they will do that quickly. So that entirely changes the nature of the political military balance in the Middle East, because it then becomes a nuclear armed area and a nuclear arms race. In the face of that possibility, it's at least conceivable that even Barack Obama could decide to use force to eliminate the Iranian nuclear program. I don't think that's likely, but it's a possibility. And in the worst case scenario, as we discussed a minute ago, that just spirals out of control because if Iran is bombed, they will retaliate. They will retaliate against Saudi Arabia and the UAE, among others. And that will become a general war in the Gulf. And that will affect your price of oil.
Right. So in that case, being long oil, if you can buy it in the 40s or 50s, with that kind of skew to the right potential is not a bad.
I love this conversation. So
we're talking about a very low.
The place is blowing up, and you say, "Oh, we must go long oil."
Yeah, we're talking about a very low probability here. So let's not all panic and go, out and invest. But you asked what the worst case.
Yeah, no, I did.
That's the worst case. I think more broadly, though, if you look at the Middle East and the fact that we've got civil wars in Yemen and Iraq and Syria and Libya, it's never been that bad. I'm the chairman of the Middle East Institute in Washington, and we've held a conference recently and asked the question, has it ever been this bad? And everyone's answer was no. In the 70 years of the Middle East Institute, we've never seen a situation like this. But the question is, why does ISIS matter? Do we really care what's going on in Syria? If that continued for a while, so what? Do we really care who runs Mosul? And the United States military is now planning with the Iraqi military a major assault on Mosul, probably in early April. Not involving, at the moment, not involving US forces. But do we really care? What difference does it make to your price of oil? It's not about Syria, and it's not about Iraq. It's about instability spreading. So we begin to see signs of the Islamic State organizing in Saudi Arabia. We've seen that. That's what people are worried about. Suddenly, the Islamic State has popped up in Libya and done a terrorist attack there in Tripoli. We've seen the Islamic State popping up as an organization now in Pakistan. It's not where they are now that's the problem. If they could just stay where they are, frankly, it wouldn't make a lot of difference to the world economy or the world stability. But if they continue to spread, particularly into countries like Saudi Arabia, which I think is more fragile than it appears politically, that's why we're worried now.
And is it, I think that's an extremely interesting point, but is the reason, would an attack on Mosul make it less likely that an Islamic State threat develops in Saudi Arabia? I mean, are those two closely linked or not?
It's a very good question, and I think we could debate that. The attack on Mosul is part of a larger strategy, which hasn't been developed yet, frankly, but a larger plan to eliminate ISIS as a threat altogether. If you can eliminate it as a threat altogether, reduce it to some minor terrorist group, that makes the threat to Saudi Arabia from ISIS go away.
Well, you're eliminating a funding source too, because they use the revenue from oil fields that they've captured.
Less and
fund
less and
terrorism.
less.
Well, the less territory they control, that's oil.
Well, but most of those oil fields that they and oil rigs, mobile oil rigs that they were using to get money last year have been blown up.
I would also say the control of Mosul is a big battleground for the negotiations with Iran, because if the West, the Kurds, and Baghdad control Mosul, Iran is weaker in its influence in its influence in Iraq.
Well, if we take Mosul, the Iranian-backed Iraqi army will be part of the force that takes it. So,
will we end up in the next couple of years with borders redrawn, or existing borders, effective borders made official? So, for example, are we going to see an independent Kurdistan? Iraqi Kurdistan is effectively autonomous already, and what difference would that make, Ton?
So the U.S. government has been very focused on keeping it as one country, the Shiites, Sunnis, and the Kurds. And the reality, the situation is very different on the ground. I was there a year ago, give or take, and just the Kurds want independence. They've done everything possible to work with the West. They've opened up the oil licenses. They have almost an oil company for most countries investing in the country. They have exports. They've done everything possible, and they're trying to work with Baghdad. And Baghdad continues to handcuff the Kurds. The U.S. policy, I think, has been flawed in trying to keep I think they've been really keeping the Kurds held back from doing what they want to do. So I think the next few months are going to be very important to see if the Kurds are able to export crude oil. The budget was just passed in Baghdad 2 weeks ago, and Baghdad has yet to honor its really the budget and pay the Kurds yet. It's only been 10 days or so, but the Kurds are really going to hold on to their card. They have oil exports. They think they could produce nearly 1 million barrels a day in a year, and if they aren't given what they want from Baghdad, I think there will be a push for independence. I don't think it's going to happen in 2015, but I think it will happen if they go through with it post-ISIS. Really.
Richard, what do you think? I mean, we have effectively, a caliphate carved out it doesn't really respect existing borders. We have Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan, effectively autonomous. Are we going to end up? I mean, these borders were, they're not more than a century old. I mean, are we going to end up with a different kind of borders, or will that just create even more instability?
I think we de facto have had Kurdistan as a separate country since about 1992. The more likely changes in borders, I think, will happen in Yemen, where the Yemen might again go back to being 2 countries. It was. I think that's possible. It's probably the most possible change in borders in the region. It's at least conceivable that the outcome of the failed state that is Libya could be a federation that becomes more and more 2 countries. In terms of Syria, you've got a failed state that is going to stay failed, I think, for a long time. And therefore, there will be large pieces of Syria, as there are today, that are not controlled by Damascus.
Just to add more gloom, I feel that we've gone from gloom in Russia, Ukraine. Now, there's not much that you've told me that makes me terribly optimistic about this part of the world. Let's add on to this another area that I know you've thought a lot about, of cybercrime. Where obviously not all cyber criminals are state or indeed remotely related to geopolitics, but it's certainly a new front that state actors can use. And there's this new term now of hybrid warfare that you can have. Putin may be waging active warfare in eastern Ukraine, but he's also doing quite a lot of hybrid things. Give me a sense of how big that aspect of the cyber threat is, the sort of using cyber warfare as an extension of warfare by other means. We'll leave just the straight commercial stuff aside, but as a tool of geopolitics, how much of a threat is it, and how much should people in the audience worry about it?
So we're putting aside cyber crime and cyber espionage, which are day-to-day things which actually cost the economy hundreds of billions of dollars. But in terms of cyber war, we've never had one. We have had a few examples of what it would look like. And the best example was an attack the United States did on Iran where the United States destroyed, I think the number is 800 nuclear centrifuges in Iran, not with bullets or bombs, but with bits and bytes. Proved for the first time that you can destroy physical objects in the real world. The Iranians came back and wiped out the computer network of Saudi Aramco. Took 30,000 endpoints, routers, servers, laptops, and turned them into bricks with no software on them, just as a demonstration that they can do it too. The Iranians then went on and took the 8 biggest banks down the street here and knocked their online banking functions off and kept their online banking functions off for weeks. And the only time it stopped was not because the United States government did something, not because the banks did something, but because the Iranians turned it off, having made a point. So I think what that says is, in the future, if there are hostilities, or quasi-hostilities, as we see a lot, nation states are going to use cyber attacks as a means of disruption and potentially destruction. The Sony attack, which, after all of the attacks on the United States by nation states, it's ironic that the Obama administration got excited because a Seth Rogen movie was attacked. For the first time, the President of the United States walked out and said, a specific nation state has attacked us and I'm going to retaliate. After all of the attacks that we've had on us by nation states, that was the one that did it. But we've seen nation state attacks on private American companies by the government of Russia, the government of China, the government of Iran, and the government of North Korea. Nation states, armies, and intelligence services attacking private American companies. And the American government's policy on this, as a matter of public policy, the American government's policy is, you're on your own. That the United States government will not defend a private American company when it's attacked by a foreign nation state. That's not sustainable over time, and Washington's already asking, why do we have this odd policy? So if we see that policy change and the American government get involved in defending private companies against nation-state attacks, then we could see an escalating low-grade cyber war absent any other war. Because in the past, we've thought about cyber war as something that happens in conjunction with conventional war.
It's like a new Cold War. No blood, but...
Certainly no blood, yeah. But substantial financial costs could result.
Isn't that what, and you mentioned the government of Russia, but Vladimir Putin is already doing, not just through cyber warfare, but through funding of the far-right parties in Europe. There are all manner of offensive actions that have taken place that are not involving bullets and guns.
Right.
I mean, do we need to think of geopolitical threats in a much broader way than we used to?
Well, if you take a nation, whether it's Russia or Iran, and you push it to the wall with economic sanctions, and you say, you have no stake left in the international economic system. And if that nation has the capability to attack the international economic system with cyber, which Iran and Russia both do, I think you could anticipate them doing it. And as much as we'd like to think that our financial system, the markets in this town, the banks in this town, are secure, they're not. Not against that kind of attack.
Okay, I'm going to open to questions in a second, but before, I'm just a bit too depressed right now. So I want, David, I'm going to ask you an upbeat question, which is, tell me a country that you look at where, in fact, the threat is not as big as people think it is. There must be one somewhere.
Sure. I think a little closer to home, maybe Mexico. We share a huge border with Mexico, and I think while 75 years ago it was a bit of a threat when they expropriated the oil industry, now they are, I think, under reformist and very thoughtfully minded leadership, they are reopening their energy economy to foreign direct investment, and I think everything I've seen from Peña and Emilio Lozoya is that they have the best interests of their citizens at heart. I think they're moving in the right direction, and they'll be a beneficiary based on those policies of global capital flows. We can invest anywhere in the world we want, or just at home. And I think that's true for most of the non-state affiliated oil company capital. And so countries that are moving in the right direction, demonstrating rule of law, and welcoming foreign direct investment will receive it. And the oil industry is very capital intensive, so the capital has to come first before you can get the oil to flow. Other countries, have not reliably, they welcome you in, but then the deal changes and you can't get out. And then I think many countries, I think Africa is on the cusp. There's some countries headed in the right direction, perhaps some falling back the other way. And since we're a private equity fund, we're not a hedge fund, and as a practical import, what that means is we're not making liquid investments. So if we invest a few dollars, we can't change our mind the next week if foreign policy changes and get it out. So we really need to have confidence in the government that's moving in the right direction. We love to find opportunities where the country's perception perhaps is negative and lagging, but we believe from our due diligence and from the people that we've met with that it's headed in the right direction.
So Mexico, what about, but none in the broader Middle East, presumably?
I think we talked a bit about Kurdistan, and I think they're not in control of their own destiny, but I think if they were, I believe they're headed in the right direction. And in an environment where oil may be a bit lower priced for a few years, it helps to have low-cost reserves, and they can actually make it up on volume because they're starting from such a low base. So they can increase production quite a bit, increase revenues, and if you believe that over time, perhaps you don't know how the revenue will be shared between they and Baghdad and others, but you have confidence that the oil is very low cost. It's needed by the world economy. It'll be produced. Having a chip on the table there could make sense. North Africa has a range of countries. I think Morocco has a very stable leadership. One of the companies that we're an investor in is drilling a very large, hopefully very large, offshore well in Morocco, and we have a lot of confidence in that country's ability to manage that oil reserves should we discover some. Egypt's had a relatively difficult period, but they're also a hydrocarbon-rich economy that desperately needs more, particularly natural gas, for domestic consumption. So these are all countries that are either in or borderline some of the troubles that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. But I think if you pick your locations carefully, you could do well economically and also do well for the country, for the people in the country, because these revenues are used to support the citizens of the country, to facilitate economic growth. And economic growth, I think, over the long term leads to more stability. People who don't have a bright near-term future in terms of education, jobs, and income per capita can turn to things like ISIS. So I think having a bit more stable government and them deploying the revenues from oil production
that's the hope, right? That's the very positive.
Not many countries have been able to do it, but the ones that have really benefited their citizens.
Let's now open to questions, and then Todd, I'll come back to you. Questions. Let's start at the back there. Lady right at the back. Gentleman right at the back. I'm sorry, I haven't got my glasses on.
Sorry for Mr. Foley. Well, do you anticipate a slowdown in the investment in midstream facilities, natural gas, liquids transport facilities, and LNG export terminals that are necessary over the longer term to keep U.S. gas from remaining stranded from world markets? I mean, because of the price risk and because of the increased counterparty risk from lower credit quality E&Ps.
Sure. So your question, I think, is focused on U.S.-based export facilities, because obviously there are LNG facilities around the world. Well, we have the benefit of having already made an investment in the facility. It'll be the first in the lower 48 to export, Cheniere's Sabine Pass facility. And so we're definitely a believer in the potential for exports of liquefied natural gas from the United States. We're also upstream investors. We own natural gas reserves in the U.S., and we believe there's an awful lot of it that will be available for a very long time at a very cost-effective price. So by exporting, we're not going to raise domestic prices at home. We think that's a pretty flat supply curve. We'll just be able to export quite a bit more. And I think the good news is that before this event, which lowered oil prices, a number of these projects were approved. And I think this is an example maybe where the U.S. government has moved along in a reasonably timely manner. The FERC working together with the DOE to approve these export facilities. It's not like the Keystone Pipeline, which is still 6, 7 years later, a yes or a no would be nice. So they've actually done pretty well. So I believe those, there are a number of projects that have already received approval that have long-term commitments. Like with Cheniere, we have 20-year take-or-pay commitments from high-quality investment-grade multinational companies. And so that construction's on track, on budget, and a few of the other projects as well. So I think we'll have at least 8 to 10 BCF a day, billion cubic feet a day of exports in the next 5, 6 years. It takes a while to build it. We've got a 2-year head start, but and our facility should come online within 12 months or so. It'll start to come online. So I think if this was happening 4 years ago, it might have killed it, right? Because natural gas prices globally, they're not linked here in the U.S., but globally they're linked on a formula basis to crude. 14, 15% of the crude price, in Japan, that's what they're buying LNG at. And so this downturn in crude oil prices is mathematically also a 50% decline in gas prices in many countries that are on the receiving end of these exports. So I do think you'll have a bit of a hiccup for projects that haven't yet achieved, a final investment decision, and they don't have shovels in the ground because the consuming countries, may think a little bit about it. But fundamentally, Southeast Asian countries in particular, and also you mentioned, Zenny, European countries, it's not just about price, it's about diversity and security of supply. No one wants the lights to go out, and when you have events, like in Japan where they had the nuclear accident, it kind of highlights the importance of having diversity of supply. So I think it's very important for countries in Southeast Asia and Europe to have access to U.S. natural gas, which can be priced not off the global oil price, but off Henry Hub, and it's not coming from Russia. I think that's in their best long-term interests, and they're making long-term decisions. The price of oil, was 100, now it's 50. Who knows what it is 5 or 10 years from now? It's probably going to be more than 50. And these countries need access to politically stable sources of natural gas, and we can provide it.
Thank you. Next question, gentleman there.
Thank you. My question is actually about cyber attack and cyber defense. I'm not a movie maker, but I was really struck by the remark that the attitude of the US government was, well, basically you're on your own. So the question I have is this: if you go back to a very earlier time in our history, the medieval period, if you were, in the area of a castle, you could go into the castle in times of danger, and the Lord would protect you in exchange for whatever services you provided under the feudal system. So my question is this: is there an intellectual framework? And I'm really asking all of you here, what does the government ask of a company in order to justify its protection? What are the principles under which a government could give serious protection to a company against the threat of cyber attack?
That's a very interesting question. Richard, why don't you start?
Well, the government has designated certain industries as critical. And we can argue about which ones are critical, but there's certainly a consensus that electric power, energy companies in general, the financial markets are critical infrastructure. And if I could change public policy, I would allow companies in critical industries to opt into a government protection program. Not mandatory, but the capability that we have in US Cyber Command, in NSA, is significant. And it's being used right now to defend the Pentagon and the DoD networks. You could extend that out. It would take time, it would take an investment, but you could extend out that government protection to certain critical industries if they elected to do it. I think that's a reasonable public policy decision. It's just one that this administration hasn't made.
Todd, I'm sorry, I'm throwing this to you out of left field, but what would you as an investor think about that? Would that make you more or less interested in that kind of an industry?
So energy has always been, there's more public data available in energy than any other sector because of security. So if there were a cyber attack against a power energy company, I would expect the government to come in because it is national security.
And if you had that net more broadly, there would be more industries that were subject to that kind of oversight and more data, as you put it.
Right.
Next question. Yes, gentleman here and then over there, second row here.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Cantor regarding the cybersecurity attacks on U.S. banks. On the consumer level, we've heard J.P. Morgan Chase had the assistance of the FBI several months ago for some hacking that occurred. Another company that comes to mind is Atrium Blue Cross Blue Shield last week had 80 million some consumer customers whose identities were disclosed with various personal data. But yet nothing seems to have indicated that these hackers have stolen this information to make damage or use for it. And I'm wondering, is there a conspiracy going on here where some of these criminals may be tied to international countries or organizations such that Iran or Russia, if they get cut off by the SWIFT system or the international banking system or whatever sanctions are further pressed on them, would then collaborate with these hackers to try to then activate these accounts. What comes to mind was an instance a few years ago, I believe, where several $1 billion of cash were stolen from ATM machines simultaneously around the world through a coordinated password attack on some, I believe, some Southeast Asian or Mideastern banks. And I'm wondering if that sort of a scale of a hacking job could occur in the future with the coordination with some of these countries that may be breaking out with the U.S.
Thank you. So is that possible? Is it likely?
I think it's certainly possible. I think it might be likely. The Russian government has very good relations with criminal hackers in Russia. They essentially have a deal. And that deal is you criminal hackers in Russia don't attack in your country, in your home country, Russia, and we'll let you go about your business and attack everywhere else. Now, there may be an aspect of that deal that requires them to do a little kickback to certain people. But nonetheless, when we saw the Russian attacks on Estonia in 2007, cyber attacks, and on Georgia in 2008, they were not done by the Russian government. They were done by Russian criminal hackers, clearly with the coordination with the government. So this is what we were talking about earlier. If you push Russia to the wall and push it out of the international economic system by heavy sanctions, then they have nothing to lose with attacking that system. And they might very well do so, and they certainly could.
Okay, next question. We probably have time for a couple more. Yes, gentleman at the back there.
I'm sorry. Hi, my name's John Keogh. I've got a question for Todd and anyone else on the panel who'd like to answer it. Todd, given what you were saying about oil production markets running at nearly full capacity, do you think people who are counting on the low oil price persisting into the future are maybe underestimating the potential for a geopolitical blow-up somewhere in the world and therefore for the price to quickly rebound?
So the U.S. is growing on a year-over-year basis at 1.1 million barrels a day. And the rig count 2 months ago was 1,930 rigs in the U.S. Currently, we're at 1,450 rigs. And the debate in the oil industry is when does the production start to roll over? And it's going to take a couple months. Do we start flattening out in 2015, 16? That's the biggest question out there on really determining what the shape of the recovery is. And people talk, is it a V-shaped recovery? Is it an L shape? Is it a U shape? Is it a W? I mean, you can throw every letter out there. But the oil market, the U.S. companies are being very quick on the response. The industry sees this as 1985, 1986, or 1998, 1999. This is not the 08, 09 market sell-off. This is the key word I've been saying is duration. I think oil companies are fearing that this is going to last longer. I think the new price, I think a lot of companies were thinking above 80 companies are in good shape. Below 80, there was going to be a lot of pain. And now there's cost deflation of in the industry of around 20%. So that $80 benchmark is probably in the high 60s or $70 a barrel. So I think that's going to be a level that a lot of companies and investors look at. As we look at the shape of the curve is in contango. So today crude is give or take $51, and 2016, 2017 is around that $65 level, as I just mentioned.
Yeah, I think it might take, my own views might take a little longer. We've had kind of a little bit of a pop here, which seems to have been short covering, but there's still excess supply, and if we run on floating storage, you could test new bottoms, and price is a result of supply and demand. So demand's been kind of anemic globally, and Europe disappointed. It's not even supposed to grow, but at least it shouldn't shrink, and it did shrink a little bit. And the engine of China just still going, but was slower. And so that disappointing demand coupled with OPEC not performing the function it had in the past was enough with just a couple million barrels or so of excess supply. We have an inelastic product for the price to drop quite a bit. But I do think if you look at an analog of natural gas production in the U.S., where we had rig count, the rig count now is like 250 rigs for gas in the U.S., and 3 years ago it was 650, and last time I checked, we're producing a lot more gas in the U.S. And one of the reasons is that when prices go down, obviously the cash available to spend in CapEx in a kind of a market and not a state-sponsored company goes down, but then they just focus on the most productive wells. And there's a very wide dispersion of break-even costs of shale oil in the U.S. And so a 30% reduction in CapEx doesn't mean a 30% reduction in oil production. It means, one, the service companies are going to have to lay off a lot of people and lower their prices, so that actually lowers the break-even costs, and the companies will focus on the most productive wells. So I think for those reasons, and the fact that demand's reasonably anemic, I think that absent any one of the 10 countries you mentioned that could have a blow-up and stop exporting, absent something like that happen, I think it'll take a little while for supply to start to self-correct, because there is a decline rate, and it is a pretty robust self-correction mechanism. Decline rate's probably triple what demand growth is, and for demand to grow.
I want to end by asking the three of you one quick thing, but I did promise one last person a question. Where was it? Yes, right there. Very briefly.
Thank you. Can I ask how concerned the panel is by tensions in the South China Seas, including as a result of increasingly assertive Chinese foreign policy?
Cool, a whole new front to worry about.
If you want to list worries, that's certainly on the list. I don't think it's in the top of my list right now. I think China, unlike Putin, the Chinese system acts a lot more rationally. And I think there's a good discussion between the United States and China on those issues.
Do either of you want to add?
Not Can't really do it in a minute.
Okay, let's before we conclude, I want to put you a little bit on the spot. The two of you on oil and you on Putin. On oil, you both talked briefly, you talked about where you thought the oil price was going in the short term. Look out a little bit further, and in 5 years, what is, give or take broadly, where is the oil price, and what is US production? If we had our cover of Shakes v. Shale in 5 years' time, are the Shakes winning or the Shale? Todd, why don't you go first?
All right, so thinking out loud, you have Iraq is going to produce a lot more oil in a couple of years. Brazil is going to produce a lot more oil. Russia's topping out. U.S. is going to be higher. So there's so many variables. Libya is offline. They were producing 1.4 million a day. They're now at, give or take, 100 to 200,000 barrels a day, depending on the day. So there's a lot of variables. Iran, they're exporting 1 million a day, and in 6 months, either the sanctions will be a lot greater and they'll be exporting 0, or they'll open up and they'll export another 500,000 barrels a day. So on the supply side, the door is wide open. It's a field goal wide. Demand's been very weak. So in China, diesel demand was negative in 2014, which is quite surprising to me. So I'd say we probably go back to a more equilibrium price of where U.S. shale is productive, but the rig count doesn't go back to this 1,900 level, 1,900 rigs that is. So I'd say probably in the low mid 60s.
What about you?
Okay, I'd probably be a little more bullish than that, in part because I don't think 5 years from now U.S. production is going to be higher than it is now. I don't think, unlike natural gas, where there's many more deposits of shale in the U.S. that are commercial for gas. And if you think about it really simply, it's easier to push something that's in gaseous form through solid rock than it is something that's a liquid, particularly a viscous liquid. There's just fewer areas where you've got exactly the perfect porosity, permeability, where you can actually do that. And so we don't have a 100+ year supply of shale oil. I haven't seen anything that would make me believe that. So I think, and we're also very commercial about running through it quickly. So I think you'll have U.S. production 5 years from now being a little bit lower than it is today. I think the oil price will be, Brent oil, let's talk, because WTI is different from Brent. I'm a little more bullish. I think it'll be north of 80, actually, because it's in U.S. dollars, so the dollar's been really strong. That's made it expensive for other countries to buy oil. And I'm a believer over that period of time in global economic growth, and global economic growth in non-OECD countries. If you look at the last decade, there's been no growth in the OECD from petroleum consumption, zero. All the growth's been outside the OECD. So over time, the market share of demand, because we talk about market share of supply, but the market share of demand has shifted. And for the first time, actually, in the last few years, more than 50% of global petroleum consumption has come from non-OECD. So the fact that the US and Europe and Japan aren't growing is every year less and less relevant for the petroleum price. And I do think 5 years is more than enough time for supply to self-correct, for the 4-ish+ % annual decline rates from existing production to happen, and all the big, expensive, long lead time projects that would have been happening right now that just got canceled, that take years to put back together, won't be coming online in 2019 and 2020. So if you add that into the mix, and if one of the 10 countries you talked about, just 1 in 10 over the next 5 years, blows something up that can't be quickly fixed and put back online, you'll have oil back over 80.
Thank you, that's fascinating. I'm going to give you the last word. Let's say probably not a 5-year horizon with Putin, but let's say a 1 or 2 year horizon. What's the status of East-West relations, and where is Putin?
It comes down to analyzing the psychology of one man, which we're notably bad at. So let's look beyond Putin. Let's look at the Russian system. If we move toward heavier sanctions, which I think we will, does that affect, and how quickly does it affect, A, his popularity in his country, which right now is very, very high, and B, how does it affect other influence centers, if there are any other influence centers, that can push him and ask him to step back? We don't know. We don't have a very good feel. Unfortunately, Putin and the people immediately around him have been talking a lot about Russia's ability to suffer, and that suffering makes them stronger. So they seem to be sending the message out, at least to the West, but maybe also internally, that we're going through a period where our economy is going to be hurt, we're not going to be part of the international system, and that's the price we're going to pay.
That's a good, sober place to end. Thank you all for a terrific discussion.